So I'll be talking a little bit about Wendell Berry's book, The Unsettling of America, Culture and Agriculture today. I'm not going to do a big long introduction to Wendell Berry. If you watch the Bill Moyers special with Wendell Berry, you'll know quite a bit about him, but it's hard to give him a particular title. He's a farmer from Kentucky. He's an activist, poet, author, philosopher. He has done many things in his life, but everything that he has done circles around to his concern for rural America, for farm families, for the rural farming way of life. Certainly the title of this book gives away some of his sentiment about how he sees rural America. The Unsettling of America is, of course, a play on words. It is both a description of a sort of de-civilization process, you might say, an unsettling in that regard, that in the name of civilizational progress has reduced and eliminated a certain earlier type of civilization. And then, of course, the other meaning of the term unsettling has to do with how unsettled those events make Wendell Berry and some of his readers. And maybe a third meaning is just more concrete, which is that in his view, in America, people are constantly being unsettled in the sense that they are constantly being moved from a settled state and forced to find another situation. So he depicts an America of rather constant motion in which it's very hard for people to settle down and to stay in one place. And of course, if you can't stay in one place, can you develop community and culture very well? Wendell Berry's answer is no, and this is very, very much a characteristic of the American scene and has been since the beginning. So he goes back to the beginning in this first chapter of The Unsettling of America and gives us a rather disturbing depiction of the destruction of Native American culture and its parallel in the destruction of rural white American culture. And that is a parallel that many people have found controversial and kind of hard to take. But Berry is not known for mincing words or for making people feel good. He comes with the idea that he wants to do that unsettling in a new way, to unsettle his readers so that they'll really think and pay attention. So on page 6 of the book, he says, if there is any law that has been consistently operative in American history, it is that the members of any established people or group or community sooner or later become redskins. That is, they become the designated victims of an utterly ruthless, officially sanctioned, and subsidized exploitation. The colonists who drove off the Indians came to be intolerably exploited by their imperial governments. And that alien imperialism was thrown off only to be succeeded by a domestic version of the same thing. The class of independent small farmers who fought the War of Independence has been exploited by and recruited into the industrial society until by now it is almost extinct. So we've already talked a bit about Thomas Jefferson's view of agrarian democracy. And his view and his preference for America was that it would remain a country dominated by small farmers. And we know that Jefferson believed that this was the best life, and largely because it would produce citizens who were independent enough and self-sufficient enough and confident enough to be able to make good decisions when it came to their political deliberation. But also it seems that he thought that this way of life was simply the healthier way and the more serene way, a way that allowed people to live life more happily, more healthily, and with less perturbation. Berry's use of the term redskins may unsettle people, but what he's trying to do with it is he's trying to first help us to recall how white American settlers objectified the Native Americans and saw them as obstacles to their progress to be pushed aside and denigrated. And he wants to have us recall that so that we can then hopefully also see the parallels between that earliest rendition of imperial wrecking with a later edition of imperial wrecking of small towns, the families that live in them, the small farm way of life that has been wrecked again in the name of a certain type of progress based on industrial society. And now I guess we can add we're moving into the post-industrial society, at least in America. So I always like to take a step back when encountering a major thinker like Wendell Berry and think about how he fits in with some of the other authors that we've covered in this class. Wendell Berry is going to clash pretty mightily with people like Robert Fraley, the Monsanto gentleman who gave a talk on agricultural technology. And that is because he represents Monsanto and the whole agenda of the corporation of Monsanto and other corporations in this line of business is to promote big agriculture. And as you'll come to see in the chapters I asked you to read, big agriculture is exactly what Wendell Berry thinks has destroyed rural America. He's going to clash with thinkers like Pamela Ronald, who gave a talk on the value of genetically modified organisms and GMO farming, especially for helping the poor in other parts of the world. I think you'll see that Wendell Berry would ask Ronald questions such as, what are we doing when we impose a way of farming that is not based in the facts on the ground and on the traditions and the people's existing ways? What are we doing to their society, to their culture, to their way of life? Would it not be better to help them as they want to be helped, or to work with the practices that they have? I don't know if that's possible, but I am trying to imagine what Wendell Berry would have to say about that. I know one thing for sure: Berry and GMOs would not mix. His way of thought is going to clash very mightily with accelerationism of any kind, because he's very dubious about whether we can, technologize ourselves out of our environmental and agricultural problems. He talks about the, quote, farm of the future in this book that is envisioned by scientists, all mechanized and kind of pristine and separated from nature more than now, except for maybe to a certain extent our hydroponics operations would be like this. And he does not speak highly of them. He's afraid that that those types of operations will make our plants much more vulnerable to superbugs, diseases, because they are not having to deal with the assaults of nature more and more, which keep them strong in a sort of evolutionary sense. Also, such agriculture doesn't take into account the millions of insects that our food supply is always counted on. It isolates everything down to one or two things that need to be accounted for, need to be preserved, and everything else is excluded. Well, he doesn't like that. So I don't think he would like accelerationism. And I threw Zizek in there because I didn't ask you to do too much with Zizek, but we do know that Zizek, as a sort of classic Marxist, is not afraid of technology or the idea of fixing problems, including agricultural problems, with technology. He would question whether there's any such thing as nature apart from man, or whether that's even an idea that really is very helpful in this case. So I put him in there as a stand-in for all Marxists. I don't think that Wendell Berry would have much use for the Marxist, or the traditional or classic Marxist anyway, who is not at all going to reject industrialization, the use of technology, increasing technology to solve food supply problems. If we think about who Wendell Berry probably resonates with more from this class, we might think of Jacques Ellul's treatment of the technological society, with his notion that technique developed past a certain extent, took on a life of its own, and became this force penetrating into the way human beings organize themselves, which makes it difficult for human beings to actually control it at this point. And that goes along with Jerry Mander's criticism of corporations as more or less faceless and not human, in the sense of having any emotions or taking any responsibility. And again, Mander treats the corporate phenomenon pretty dispassionately. He doesn't blame corporations, because corporations can't be blamed because they're not thinking, willing beings. They are made up of human beings who ought to be able to do those things. But like Ellul, he's dubious about whether the individuals involved can now stop them. They have a fiduciary responsibility to their many, many shareholders to make a profit, and Mander says that this is why they tend to not work in the interests of the majority of people, and yet they are acting very rationally. I think that Wendell Berry's views about modern agriculture, big agriculture, go along with both of those thinkers' views. I threw John Zerzan in there not because Wendell Berry would actually agree with his call to primitivism, but because his views do serve as kind of a contrast on the other side to Berry. They resonate to a certain extent because Berry is also nostalgic about the lush, beautiful nature of his childhood, and he mourns the loss of it, the way that the rivers and creeks have died in his area, and so on, and he longs for a simpler way of life. He does not long to return back to some sort of hunter-gatherer society, however. And in fact, Berry is critical, I think this is in the first chapter that you're reading, he's critical of the Sierra Club and other organizations like that want to preserve pristine nature, because he says this is, more or less, it's kind of anti-human, and he doesn't like that. He doesn't think that nature does work at its best without human beings. Human beings, in other words, can be very positive towards nature if they take on the role of the so-called husbandman, which just means, caretaker or steward of nature, helping it to do its best and culling off what they can, as long as it doesn't reduce its productivity. In Berry's view, we are a part of the world. We are part of the animal kingdom. We deserve to live like everybody else and take our share, so to speak, but just not, in his view, to ruin it, which would and is, in his view, making it more difficult for future generations to live well. But still, there's a certain nostalgia in Berry for a more pristine past, and certainly Zerzan's thought is kind of like the extreme example of that type of nostalgia. And of course, as I've already mentioned, Berry's way of thinking resonates with Thomas Jefferson's, very much so. And I guess I would have to, and I will add Russell Kirk's as well. Jefferson and Kirk, again, both have this notion that the agrarian way of life is the best way of life for the sake of health as well as for the sake of our democracy. But in addition to those two, I would have to say the author that we've covered in class who most resonates with Wendell Berry's points of view in The Unsettling of America is Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land. We read an excerpt from that book where Hochschild tries to understand why people in rural America seem to be very friendly to the corporate agenda, and it's based upon politics that they see to be pro-family and pro, the sort of simple rural way of life that they think of as the most wholesome. They don't see corporate interests as clashing with these other interests. And she goes and tries to figure out why that is and begins to develop some empathy for these people in their situation, which is unsettled, in effect dispossessed. These are people who maybe a couple of generations prior would have had healthy families, communities, relatively speaking, of course, decent jobs, stability, and who have been turned out and have been rearranged and dispersed because of economic changes. Many leave the area in search of other jobs, and many never find as good and settled positions as they did before. If they stay put, they have to deal with a different type of job with less security and with a growing amount of pollution in its wake, which affects their way of life. Especially, she talks about their love of fishing and hunting and how these industries have affected their way of life in that regard, but also for those who farm on the land, they have to, more or less conform, or they're very hard-pressed to be able to stay in business. Hochschild admits to being quite liberal, and yet, strangely enough, she wrote a book that more or less attempted to, in a way, understand and defend rural America, even though she disagrees with their political position. And of course, we're speaking very broadly there because we do not want to say that everybody in rural America automatically supports a particular political position. But on average, and she uses the statistics, they tend to support a more conservative approach, which has become more and more identified with free enterprise, with not enough distinction for her liking between small business and international corporations. I dare say that if Wendell Berry hasn't met Hochschild, he should meet her. They'd probably be best of friends because I think that they pretty much agree 100% on all of that. So getting back into the book, as I said, Wendell Berry first talks about this first wave of destruction in which the settlers come and they push off the Native Americans from their land and their way of life, which isn't seen as productive, not as much using the land as well as the settlers could. And then he quotes Bernard DeVoto from a book called The Course of Empire, in which he says, this isn't DeVoto, but this is Wendell Berry's take on DeVoto. He says he is so clearly describing a revolution that did not stop with the subjugation of the Indians, but went on to impose substantially the same catastrophe upon the small farms and the farm communities, upon the shops of small local tradesmen of all sorts, upon the workshops of independent craftsmen, and upon the households of citizens. Along these lines, I recently ran into an association which claims it's fighting for the right to repair your appliances, fighting for the rights of Americans who want to work in the trade of appliance repair. It's very difficult these days to find people who can repair appliances. So, and oftentimes if you can, the cost is so high because it's so rare and so much in demand that it almost makes as much financial sense to just buy another appliance. But then of course that puts a lot of appliances into the landfill prematurely. This is from their website, which is repair.org. It says, repair is the lifeblood of local economies. Our members make products last longer, save owners money, and create jobs. Fight for your right to repair. Take action. When manufacturers own the only repair shop around, prices go up and quality goes down. Competition is better for customers, but mom-and-pop repair shops are struggling with unfair practices by multinational corporations. Consumers and repair pros are starting to fight back. And it goes on. But I mention that just as an example of the phenomenon here that Wendell Berry's talking about that is still going on. The only repair place I could find, although maybe I missed one, but I made 5 or 6 calls. Ultimately, I landed on Sears, which is a seller of appliances. Wendell Berry says, ironically, air remains the only necessity that the average American user can still get for himself, and the revolution has imposed a heavy tax on that by way of pollution. Commercial conquest is far more thorough and final than military defeat. The Indian became a redskin not by loss in battle, but by accepting a dependence on traders that made necessities of industrial goods. This is not merely history, he says, it is a parable. So he's again comparing his view of the Native American experience with this later conquest that destroyed the small farms, communities, and independent tradesmen and craftsmen. Once again, Wendell Berry, not afraid to offend, calls out some of the, quote, movements of recent years that have been representing various claims that nurture has to make against exploitation. He says the women's movement, for example, when its energies are most accurately placed, is arguing the cause of nurture. Other times it is arguing the right of women to be exploiters, which men have no right to be. The exploiter is clearly the prototype of the masculine man, the wheeler-dealer whose practical goals require the sacrifice of flesh, feeling, and principle. Now, ultimately, that seems to be a statement that is not critical of women, but it's one of these areas that, well, Wendell Berry has, said things that offend almost everybody, which I guess you can't say hardly anything of substance without risking offending someone, but while the statement could be read to say that everybody ought to be more like a certain ideal of the feminine nature, which he identifies with nurturing. But instead, a lot of women as well as men identify with the masculine nature, which is, as he puts it, the exploiter, the wheeler-dealer who is ready to sacrifice feeling and principle, I guess, for profit. Not a terribly flattering view of the masculine principle. Next, Berry takes aim at the development of agribusiness, which he sees as initiated by the U.S. government. And he starts out specifically by taking aim at Earl Butz, who was Secretary of Agriculture during the Nixon administration, made famous for saying that food is a weapon. Now, there are a lot of things that phrase refers to. One is that food is inevitably an instrument of diplomacy. And as you know from reading Sun Tzu, if you have, or Karl von Clausewitz, either one, diplomacy is just warfare by other means. In other words, it's an instrument of national power. So a country wants to be in a good position to be able to wield that power through having an agricultural surplus as well as the knowledge to be able to help people in other countries develop their own agricultural system if they want to. Also, food aid, if you have a surplus, or at least a surplus of money, can be used to help allies, or it can be refused to help enemies, to hurt enemies. More generally, it's an acknowledgement that in a globalized economy, such as we have really when it comes to food, any sort of disruption in that system is going to cause potentially catastrophic food supply problems somewhere in the world. Countries in a position economically as well as militarily to be able to cause or to start such crisis or to eliminate or solve the crises are the ones with the power. Now, we've all known this for a long time, but I think that what stood out about Mr. Butts is that in the early 1970s, he said food is a weapon, and sort of, therefore, in Berry's view, militarized food is the way that he puts it. So for Butts, that meant the ramping up of the industrialization of agriculture in this country, including its mechanization and the use of chemicals, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides. So anyway, in this way, Berry identifies the trend towards big agriculture very much with the decisions that were made by the U.S. government about what type of agriculture to support and to subsidize, using the tax code, using the budget we had for research and development, using the buying power of the U.S. government in the name of food aid, and other agricultural subsidies. And he ends that first chapter with the suggestion very much that in the process of all this, government has gotten very big and overbearing, and the economy has gotten out of individuals' control, and that democracy is in peril. He says towards the end, the old idea is still full of promise. It is potent with healing and with health. It proposes the independent, freestanding citizenry that Jefferson thought to be the surest safeguard of democratic liberty. And perhaps most important of all, it proposes an agriculture based upon intensive work, local energies, care, and long-living communities. That is, to state the matter from a consumer's point of view, a dependable long-term food supply. So there he not only extols the type of agriculture that he's going to promote, the small ag, with, freestanding citizenry and liberty, but also with true security, as he mentions there, a dependable long-term food supply, breaking away from the global food system and returning to local production, in his view, would actually make people safer, whereas Earl Butts, in his view, sold people the dream that the bigger the agricultural enterprise and the more global its reach, the more secure they would be. Wendell Berry just flat disagrees. So, Chapter 4, I'll just briefly talk about a few of the main points. It's entitled The Agricultural Crisis as a Crisis of Culture, and does kind of continue along the same lines as Chapter 1, exploring particularly the cultural impact of these changes we've been talking about. He says on page 45, few people whose testimony would have mattered have seen the connection between the modernization of agricultural techniques and the disintegration of the culture and the communities of farming, and the consequent disintegration of the structures of urban life. What we have called agricultural progress has, in fact, involved the forcible displacement of millions of people. What he's talking about is really a very similar phenomenon to what happened in Europe in the late 16th and in the 17th and early 18th century, when people were moving off of the farmland where they had lived for generations in this feudal relationship with the lords, in favor of this new type of government that was unitary and consolidated and had less to do with those ranks and privileges of the old aristocracy, who began to kind of molder and lose their property and their importance over time. But the first step was that the nobility, in an attempt to make more money when trade started to rev up, decided that they could make more money grazing sheep and cattle rather than having the peasants on the land, and so they began to just throw them off, and there was this mass exodus into the cities, and then that changed the nature both of the countryside and of the city, and of course price of food went up, the wages in the cities for the workers were low if they were able to find jobs at all, so there was this huge underclass that developed. Well, Berry is saying a similar type of thing happened in this situation where the government encouraged the modernization of agricultural techniques, which changed the nature of farming. So far fewer people were needed on the farm, which meant a lot of those people could not even stay on rural land if they wanted to, then moved into the cities. Similar type of thing, there being a glut of labor and not enough high-paying jobs, and so a change in the urban environment which grew, and then eventually also produced suburban cities as well. Now we tend to think of this as developments that occurred based upon the blind forces of the economy, and one of the more interesting aspects of Wendell Berry's treatment is that he blames the government for having initiated these changes, much in the same way that the government decided that a highway system was a good idea instead of light rail, in the name of national security, in the 1970s in particular, although I think you could go back as early as the Roosevelt administration and some of the changes that for farming that it proposed as well. So in this way, he's blaming government more than Ellul's technique as a whole, although I still think that he also sees the capitalist economy as kind of morphing out of individuals' control. But there's a paragraph down at the bottom of page 45 that kind of sums up who Wendell Berry blames. He says, in this community-killing agriculture with its monomania of bigness is not primarily the work of farmers, though it has burgeoned on their weaknesses. It is the work of institutions of agriculture, the university experts, the bureaucrats, and the agribusinessmen who have promoted so-called efficiency at the expense of community and of real efficiency, and quantity at the expense of quality. And then he goes on to talk about in 1973, 1,000 Kentucky dairies went out of business. Now that commentary is actually reminiscent of Chris Hedges too, isn't it? Then, Berry morphs back around to, food is not a weapon in his view. He says it's a cultural product. And here, in and around pages 46 and 47, is where we see the Burkean conservative side of Wendell Berry coming out. For instance, he's skeptical of the specialists and the experts as being too focused on their particular specialty, but not seeing the impact for people and communities. He says, it is suggested both by the organization of the universities and by the kind of thinking they foster that farming shall be the responsibility only of the College of Agriculture, that law shall be in the sole charge of the professors of law, that morality shall be taken care of by the philosophy department, reading by the English department, and so on. In other words, we become so specialized at the university that none of us can see past our silo, and so we aren't as able to contribute to the common good. And then he could be channeling Edmund Burke from Burke's classic Reflections on the Revolution in France, when he says, "A culture is not a collection of relics or ornaments, but a practical necessity, and its corruption invokes calamity. A healthy culture is a communal order of memory, insight, value, work, conviviality, reverence, aspiration. It reveals the human necessities and the human limits. It clarifies our inescapable bonds to the earth and to each other. It assures that the necessary restraints are observed, that the necessary work is done, and that it is done well. A healthy farm culture can be based only upon familiarity and can grow only among a people soundly established upon the land. It nourishes and safeguards a human intelligence of the earth that no amount of technology can satisfactorily replace." So from Berry's point of view, people actually have to be living on the land, that there needs to be enough people who make their livelihood from the land that they care about each other and they care about the land. If they're remote from the land, if the people working upon it are very few and they are beholden to their superiors and not to their community, they won't care enough about how well it's taken care of. And furthermore, and maybe even more importantly to Berry, the community will continue to disintegrate. He says, same place, "We now have only the sad remnants of those communities. If we allow another generation to pass without doing what is necessary to enhance and embolden the possibility now perishing within them, we will lose it altogether. And then we will not only invoke calamity, we will deserve it." Well, this was a book that was originally published in 1977. We also have Wendell Berry's suspicion of industrialized urban areas coming in here with a classically conservative notion that when people move off the land and work as wage laborers and salaried people in cities, they become too dependent upon those who are more powerful than themselves to be able to make sound judgments about the system under which they live, and again, to be good citizens, effective citizens. Anyway, in this chapter, Berry calls for more respect for protecting the source, as he puts it. This is on page 51. He says, "The seed, the food species, the soil, the breeding stocks, the old and wise, the keepers of memories, the records." He says a culture cannot survive long at the expense either of its agricultural or of its natural sources. So he is asking us to turn around and take a look at the effects of our progress, as we may want to put it, and think about what we want to change, and think again about some of these old but tried and true sources of security and meaning, and again, most importantly in this chapter, culture. That's why he includes the old and the wise, the keepers of memories, and the records. These are things that previous cultures have all needed and thrived on. And so, a big theme in Berry's writing is that we have kind of lost our moorings, and as such, our culture and our civilization are in peril. So he calls for curbed competition, which is not the same thing as the elimination of competition, but it's also not the same thing as a vision of laissez-faire economics that Berry argues doesn't exist when it comes to agriculture anyway. So in effect, competition has already been curbed in his view, but it's been curbed in the direction of favoring a particular type of business instead of another. And I mean, what I'm seeing here is an argument that it should be curbed in another direction, that the political power should be used to favor the development or the redevelopment of small agriculture that's more sustainable, so that local communities and cultures can thrive, and so that true national security would increase. It's interesting. Again, I've pointed this out many times now about various authors in this class. It's hard to pin them down politically. Just when you think that you've got somebody who comes from the left, they sound like they're coming from the right, and vice versa. And that's because they're among other things, they're dealing with a subject matter that is difficult, if not impossible, to handle correctly by looking at it through some predetermined political lens that's very prone to fostering the type of infighting that we've all come to dislike so much. So if you find yourself having trouble categorizing, and I've tried to do a little bit of categorizing by trying to clump him with other thinkers and try to show the association between his way of thinking and a classical type of conservatism. But if you still have difficulty trying to pin him down, just realize this is an area where pinning a person's writing down on ideological grounds might not be a very fruitful enterprise or a very necessary one ultimately. As a political theorist, I try to help people understand through the creation and application of categories, but there's always room for going beyond those categories too. And I hope that I've been able to express that as well in treating some of these authors like Wendell Berry. Okay, bye.